Good evening, I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. Our big focus today is on an untold or certainly an undertold story of the COVID pandemic, the inconvenient truth of the gender gap. India's making finally great progress and pace with its vaccination rollout. But do men and women have equal access to vaccines? And in fact, in general, is there equal access to healthcare through this pandemic? That is our big focus on the program today. Let's take a look at some of the key markers that we do know. We do know that although the gender gap is improving when it comes to access to vaccines, there still continues to be a distinct inequality between how men and women in India are accessing vaccines. There is a regional variation here. There are, in fact, 11 states that are finally showing no such gender gap, but many other states continue to lag behind for a whole host of complex reasons, and you'd be surprised to discover that Delhi, the national capital, in fact, leads in this gender gap when it comes to vaccinations. The COVID pandemic has been cruel for women and girls in many, many other ways. The lockdown, of course, saw a spike in domestic abuse and violence, and we're also seeing the phenomenon of COVID child brides as girls in particular, underage girls, continue to come under pressure to get married before they turn 18 as schools still remain far away from a full reopening. To look at all of these issues, we're talking to two academics who have done sterling work in this specific area. Let's introduce them today. We're joined by Rohini Pande. She's joining us from the Yale Economic Growth Center. And we're also joined by Radhika Jain, who's a health economist at Stanford University. Welcome to both of you. Rohini, let me start by asking you to talk about the gaps in access to vaccines. Now, I had a chance to look at a paper done by your center, and of course, till July, there was a very, very big gap. That gap still, the gap has begun to narrow, but it's still there. Can you take us through what you're finding in this gender gap when it comes to vaccines?
Yeah. Thanks, Barkha. Thanks for having me on the show. So, as you said, India has, over the last 6 months, made a lot of progress in vaccinations. So, what we saw at the early stage was in some ways a mixed picture. So there was, for instance, early on a prioritization of frontline health workers. Many frontline health workers tend to be women. So for that subpopulation, you would perhaps even have seen more women getting the vaccine. But what we've seen emerge over time is a very clear trend that women are getting left behind. This is reducing, but still remains on average around 5 percentage points. So as of October 8th, we still see a 5 percentage point gap. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of variation across states and also demographics. So one group I think in particular you want to worry about is older women. They seem to be less likely to be getting the vaccine. So if you want to ask what are the reasons behind it, we've done some amount of work just looking at the correlations between access to smartphones and access to under this program. This obviously is at quite an aggregate level. But what you certainly see, first of all, is, as we know, there's a very large gender gap in smartphone usage. So from the 2018 Financial Inclusion Insights, I think first you have to remember overall, something like smartphone usage is low. Only 17% have a smartphone. And then if you look at that among men and women, relatively few women, under 10% of women own a smartphone. So why am I emphasizing a smartphone rather than a regular phone, even though overall, mobile phone usage also shows similar gaps, is that a lot of the platforms that you needed to register through were easiest to use if you had a smartphone. You had to register on a platform and, get an OTP in order to then get a vaccination slot. This is just going to be harder for those who don't have a phone. Even over and above that, even if you had a smartphone, all the data tells us that digital fluency is just much lower for women. And this, again, would be a reason why we would see this gap emerge. And then finally, I think there are a set of reasons that have a long history, for instance, mobility restrictions. If you look at the National Family Health Survey, over 50% of Indian women, especially in rural areas, report that they cannot even go to the Anganwadi center alone. And so again, this idea that first you have to go through an entire technologically difficult system, and then you actually have to leave the house and go there, not just find someone to take care of your kids or housework, but also kind of go to a place that may not be very female friendly. There are not a lot of COVID centers that are for women only. I think all of these combine to just make it much harder for women to do this.
It's very interesting, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this smartphone phenomenon. Why, in so many parts of India, the phone, in particular the smartphone, is seen to be somewhat threatening when women and young girls even have one. We have traveled to villages where there's sharp resistance to women actually owning a smartphone, even when it is economically possible to do so. And given that so much of India's vaccination program is through the COVID app, this is obviously having consequences. So can you talk about the phone as this kind of metaphor of female, for possible female autonomy that is considered threatening?
Yeah, so I think one thing you see in the data that's very striking is what's the point at which girls lose access to a smartphone. So if you look at something like the Indian Human Development Survey, if there is a family phone, there's a question on who has access to it. And so girls actually lose access essentially around the time they hit puberty. And then that just remains lower than men throughout. So I think what we have failed to do is create a use case, if you will, for young women and older women using phones for things like safety, in order to access the job market, in order to just talk to people. Rather, there's a perception that what a smartphone or any phone will be used for is to move outside the secure arena in terms of who you talk to, who your friends are, possibly who your boyfriends are, maybe at worst case scenario, even who you choose to marry. And so as a result, what we see in kind of survey after survey, if you distinguish between what they would call supervised use, so you use a phone, but it's on speakerphone or someone else can listen in, their acceptance is actually reasonably high. What I think people are very concerned about is what they would call unsupervised use, that you can go and we don't know who you're talking to or what you're doing on Facebook. Yeah. And then that gets constrained and therefore phones get removed. The ironic feature in all of this, sorry, just to say one thing, is that actually when you talk to women, the digital space is not a safe space for them. They have a lot of cyber threats. They have, people calling them up. So ironically, it's sort of perceived by others as, mainly by family members and men, as something that women are using in untoward ways, but women themselves are also not very comfortable using it. Sorry, Barkha, I cut you off.
No, that's very, very striking. And I do want to come back to you, Rohini, in a few minutes to talk about, the vaccine percentage point difference and why the regional variations exist. But let me take this also to Radhika. Radhika, I know as a health economist, you've been looking at this gender gap in other ways and spaces. Some of them have leapt out at one through this pandemic. In particular, the lockdown was especially cruel for women. And I'll just share a small example of a village I traveled to in Rajasthan, where we saw this phenomenon of underage girls being pushed into child marriages. That trend had never really gone away, but we've seen a spike. And those are young girls that we met, and activists are actually, Rohini, distributing smartphones to them to try and provide some agency, also to train them as journalists, also to train them in other ways that may make them financially independent. But what was really striking, Radhika, is that we had mothers say that they almost thought it was safer to perform what's called the Gona, which is the send away ceremony to the so-called husband, earlier than scheduled, because the home during any lockdown was no longer a safe space for their daughters. So I'm just giving you one example of what I encountered in my reporting, but go ahead with some of the trends you've noticed and you've picked up.
Sure. I think there's lots of research that's actually showing that domestic violence against women and children within the household has spiked during this pandemic. What I've sort of looked at is, inequalities in healthcare access, gender inequalities in healthcare access more generally. And, there's just in area after area, well before the pandemic, you see there's evidence of, women are less informed of available public health programs and systematically get fewer healthcare inputs. And even with, big sort of programs that are intended to address gender inequality, as like this health insurance program, what my research finds is that women are far less likely to utilize these programs. And so these inequalities were there before the pandemic, and to some extent, the pandemic just sort of heightened them. Some of my research that looked at the effects of the lockdown very early in early 2020 finds that why the lockdown affected access to healthcare for everybody, but disproportionately affected women. And with large sort of effects on disparities in health outcomes as a result. But mortality effects were much larger amongst women as a result of this.
Mm-hmm. Which were the areas that you found this gender gap to be the most grave and the most striking, in particular during the pandemic? We were. I think that, so in terms of the kinds of health services where we found, where the disparities were biggest, I think many people have documented that access to sort of the kinds of healthcare that could not be delayed were most effective, which includes either critical health services, also includes maternal care, right? Child deliveries were the sort of thing that were continued during the pandemic and could not be delayed, but were sort of when women did not have access to hospitals, it meant that they had to find other places to deliver their children. Yeah, that is something we encountered a lot in our reporting, what was happening with pregnant women. There were very few virtual clinics, and virtual clinics, again, it goes back to the phone and the digital divide. There's a generic digital divide, which is agnostic to gender, and then there is a specific gender digital divide. Radhika, we now know that there has been, for example, we know that there has been a significant increase in tuberculosis deaths in India because, it was a COVID-centric healthcare response. We know that pregnant women suffered enormously. They also got the green signal for the vaccine very late. What have you picked up in your research in terms of non-COVID problems as specific to women, and how they dealt with them or how they were able to access healthcare? You're on mute, Radhika. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So what I was going to say is actually, besides the sort of women-specific healthcare, like we were talking about, pregnancy-related care. What I find is that this, sort of, even for health conditions that affect women and men equally, one of the things a couple of the things we look at is child immunizations, as well as dialysis care. We find that, this is where women, the same disruptions to healthcare affect women much more than they do, or girls much more than they do men. And this is because of the decisions that the households are making, right? That the households typically prioritize the care of men. And so the same sort of health system disruptions end up deterring care seeking for women much, much more than they do for men. And so actually some of the research that I was mentioning earlier with Pascaline Dupont, also at Stanford, we find that, increases in dialysis-related mortality, for example, were much, much higher during the pandemic, were much, much higher amongst women in Rajasthan than they were amongst men.
Very interesting, because in fact, most people, I remember in the early stages of the pandemic, couldn't even get a dialysis appointment because the COVID test was needed. And, again, you go back to the disparity in accessing healthcare. Rohini, I want to go back to the vaccines. You said things have improved, but there's still about on aggregate, a 5 percentage point difference. But if you break it down, there's some states that are doing better than other states. What does your research tell you? Which are the states that are doing better, and do we know why?
So, let me say, just as a caveat up front, that when you look at these differences across states, taking that and then linking it to an individual outcome is obviously hard. It's what we would often call an ecological fallacy. So what we don't have is individual data broken down by, let's say, age or literacy. So what you're doing is you're trying to look at, let's say, state level rates or district level rates in literacy, and sort of assume that tells you something about individual outcomes, which, hopefully is right, but isn't necessarily right. So one thing I would just say in general is that it would be very useful is to both see some of the gender data disaggregated by demographics. But the other thing that I haven't seen is the gender gap across the first and the second dose. Because one thing that we have heard about is just on the individual demand side, there is some amount of vaccine hesitancy related to concerns of the implications of the vaccine for reproductive health or, you say, fertility. And that hesitancy in general across the world has something that increases with time. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily decrease. So I think it will be useful for us to know about the difference in the first and second dose. And the one fact that I can't speak to is whether the extent of, say, rumors or gossip it varies across districts and states in a way that is predictive. That could well be happening. But what we do see is, many of the things that you would assume to be predictive are predictive. For instance, if you look at the district level and you look at trends in women's mobility or female literacy or phone ownership, they are predictive in ways that you would expect. The other thing that as we talked about is there are places like Delhi, for instance, where one thing I wonder about how much of these gaps that you've put up here are being driven, for instance, by migrant populations as well, which often tend to be more male, right? Yeah. So one thing that this is potentially linked to in Delhi is, we know Delhi also has a very, very large gap in female labor force participation relative to male labor force participation. So if women are staying at home, they're not working, they may both feel safer, they may believe they're less at risk. But they also have, less pressure from, say, employers or others to go and get vaccinated. So to the extent that this is certainly true where I'm in the US and may well be coming in India, is that, if you start seeing mandates by employers or requirements in public spaces to get vaccinated, you may be concerned that will actually increase the gender gap because women are just less present in public spaces and the labor force. So,
but to your point that some of the things that you do expect to be predictive are, if you just take, I don't have the disaggregated data and I don't know who does, but the southern states, if you look at Andhra and Kerala, they do appear to do better in terms of that parity between women and men when it comes to vaccinations, and we can possibly extrapolate that to other equities that exist in the gender space, or would that be a leap?
I think you could, but it could also be that they have a better functioning healthcare system, right? So that's what I said, is that I think the patterns are very, very suggestive that the constraints that women face in other spaces spill over here. And that's why the work, for instance, that Radhika and Pascaline have done is very interesting, because it links it to other disparities in healthcare. But I do think there is an important caveat that, especially when you do something like comparing southern and northern states, something like, say, literacy rates among women may be higher as well. And so the gender gap is lower, but is that by virtue of being a woman, or is it by virtue of being more or less educated? I just think a lot more can be done by just disaggregating the demographic data on who's getting vaccines. And because I think the constraint of not having that makes us always try to link aggregates at a district or state level and predictions from that, which are just...
Absolutely. Radhika, can you speak a little bit to what are the other factors that actually influence either an increasing sort of equality when it comes to men and women in healthcare, or a decline, the converse as well?
I'll say a little bit less about trends and just sort of what we have seen. I think when we think about inequalities in access to healthcare, people typically talk about barriers that women face, like Rohini mentioned, mobility. Women find it difficult to leave the house, let alone get to the healthcare center. They have far less decision-making power. So in the household, especially over financial resources. So to the extent that seeking healthcare requires any spending, that's an additional barrier that they face. There's also quite often this perception that women just need less healthcare, because, especially in the case of vaccines, I think, there's this idea that it's the men who are leaving the house, who are engaging with other people, who are, and that they are the breadwinners. And so they are the ones that are most important to protect. And you see this in, much, much beyond COVID vaccines, but I think, it may be playing out in the domain of vaccines as well. And then, a sort of really tragic factor that we've seen play out in healthcare is that systematically households underinvest in care for girls and women than they do for boys, and so I mean, this is sort of deeper gender biases that are playing out in the healthcare space. I can't, as Rohit said, I can't say to what extent exactly they are playing a role in the disparities in vaccination, but it's sort of it's not surprising that we see these gender disparities in vaccination as well as we do elsewhere in healthcare.
Okay, I've just got a couple of minutes left, Radhika. Is there something prescriptive in terms of sort of, policy? I mean, one of the things is that we need the data to be disaggregated to understand this better, and that's an obvious one. But just in terms of, Radhika, where your research has led you, you have Rajasthan as a state you've looked at very, very closely. Whereas I mentioned to you, we actually had child marriages coming down, and we now see a spike, and it'll take us some time before we know how much the spike has been statistically. In terms of policy or prescriptive measures, Radhika, is there anything that stands out?
What I can say does not necessarily work. What my research has actually shown quite clearly is that sort of universal policies that sort of target that are trying to reduce the barriers for everybody do not necessarily effectively reach women, right? What in order to close the gender disparities, you really need to do things that specifically, you need to understand the barriers that women are facing in the local space, these barriers may vary across parts of India, and then specifically target them. Just sort of, opening up more centers and things may not necessarily close the gaps that you see in gender disparities. I think the other thing that, we find some evidence of that, might be a strategy to use here is that the combination of sort of local, one of the things I found is that local female political leaders at the Gram Panchayat level, for example, can do a lot actually to help close gender disparities in healthcare access. And so, in collaboration, they tend to work with the Ashas to do this. And this is consistent with broader research across India that's been showing some, relationship between political sort of representation and female healthcare. Anyway, the point being that, recruiting, sort of enlisting local leaders, whether the political leaders, the healthcare workers, might be one way to reach women more effectively.
It's just so interesting that you mentioned local leaders, because we're at a point in India where there are state governments that do want to bring in kind of coercive population laws. There's been a lot of pushback to them, which we do know will punish women, and in particular poor women the most. And talking about that lack of equality, as both of you know, even access to contraception is a struggle for so many women. Rohini, last word to you. When you look at this data and, just at least the data you're able to access, is there something prescriptive that leaps out at you that you think governments are not paying enough attention to?
Yeah, I think there is, and I hesitate to actually suggest it, because I think one thing we have actually seen through the pandemic is the overuse of, for instance, ASHA workers who are paid less, who are on contracts. And, I think far too often ASHA workers, SHG workers become sort of this unpaid backbone of the rural administration. But what is true is they are, I'd say, somewhat better informed, and women listen to them. So I think, just as Radhika was talking about local leaders, I think ASHA workers, SHGs do have some ability to reach women, reach out to them. But I also think we should be thinking more imaginatively about how we make vaccines available. One system that does work quite well, and we saw this work quite well through COVID, is ration shops. So, to the extent that PDS shops are actually something that are a space that most families in rural India at least use and know how to use, using that as a way to give out, say, vouchers that you can use, or getting onto the list for the vaccine rather than having to do things on your phone, would also help by take away from the emphasis on needing to have a phone or then having to queue up for a long time. So I think trying to use these features, of at least in rural India or villages and others that are there, would be important. In urban areas, I think, it's going to be important to have some kind of campaigns to reach women. I really think in urban areas, the fact that women are not working is going to be a huge hindrance going ahead in how you reach them. So we need to think hard about that.
That's really interesting. And the idea of the ration shop as a kind of community corner, where it isn't radical for a woman, she'd go there anyway. That is one way of minimizing the consequences of limited mobility. Thank you, Rohini and Radhika. This has been really interesting. And I hope we do have more data soon to access and to understand these trends better. But in the meantime, it's also not an issue spoken of enough. Why are fewer women getting vaccinated? Why are fewer women in India able to access healthcare? These are really compelling questions, and we continue to ask them. Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us, and thank you for watching. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support